BSCP Strategic Communications Toolbox. This webinar is a final session of a three-part series designed to show how SEAs can use this recently completed toolbox to develop a new or enhance your existing strategic communications plan. So my name is Heather Sabotsky, and I am a Senior Study Director at the BSCP Center at WestStat. And with me today to give us some perspective from the practitioner point of view will be Commissioner Randy Watson from the Kansas Department of Education and Denise Kaler, who is the Director of Communication and Recognition Programs at KSDE.
Hi, Heather. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So before we begin, I want to confirm that all the attendees can see the presentation on your screen. And if you can't see the presentation, click that hand icon, and then somebody will, a technical support person will help you. And do the same thing along the way throughout the presentation. If you have any problems or questions, you can click that hand icon and someone will help you out. And also note, we recommend that you follow along with the toolbox during the presentation. And when I call out specific tools, I'll actually call out what page number so that you can kind of see, you know, thread along with the content and match up the content with what the discussion points are. We provided a link to the toolbox and some emails. I've sent it to some people, and you can get it from the BSCP website, and also you can pull it from this WebEx system. Do you want to explain how to do that, James?
Sure. So if you don't already have the toolbox available, we have placed a link to the resource in the chat area of the session. You may need to click the chat heading along the right side of your screen. It should be towards the bottom. It'll have a right-facing arrow, and that'll expand the chat area, and you should see a message from me with the provided link. That'll show up momentarily. Now, when you use this link, note that it will load in a new window. So in order to return to the presentation from that window, you will need to minimize that toolbox window, and then you'll be able to see the presentation again.
Okay, thank you, James. So although I know some of you attended the first two webinars, we'll be doing a brief review for those of you that are new to this series about strategic communications and what that is, and the benefits of having a strategic communication plan. We'll talk about how the tasks in the Module 6 are related to plan, implementation, and evaluation. And we'll demonstrate how to use the BSCP Center Toolbox to help you with those things. And then Randy and Denise will share their real-world experience on engaging community to create, support, and implement their state plan. So the goal for today is to help you become familiar with the contents and the potential tools in Module 6 and have opportunities to share ideas and questions with the panel experts and the other SEA folks and regional center folks that are on the line. So while I'm providing content overview, please feel free to type in questions as they arise, and then we'll address them at a logical point in time. And there'll be we're going to have some discussion questions coming up in a minute where you can just ask your questions. So another quick brief review on what strategic communications is. So there are 5 major components to the BSCP Strategic Communication Framework, which you see up there on your screen. We created this visual to explain how strategic communications is different from typical non-systemic communication approaches. So the main thing to note is that strategic communication is a centralized process driven by SEA vision and goals. So the driver there is that central green circle. And then the process is led and supported by SEA leadership, that top blue box. But it also acknowledges the critical role of both internal and external stakeholders. A lot of traditional approaches kind of just think about external, but this process really does include internal and external. And you'll see that that leadership, internal and external stakeholder circles overlap the vision and goals. And that's how we kind of show that it's really a process that's driven from the inside of the agency out. So to ensure the process yields intended actions for the agency vision and goals, the approach is supported by a continuous improvement process where you are implementing, evaluating, adjusting, and repeating. And this ongoing refinement is a way to improve stakeholder buy-in and maximize chances of success for implementation of state plans. So by linking these 5 components, strategic communication better enables SEAs to focus on clarity, consistency, control, and coordination of agency communication efforts. So since strategic communication processes involve standardization across multiple divisions in SEAs, creating a formal strategic communication plan can help by employing an agency-wide process that's tied to agency goals, so that green circle in the middle that our framework has. And then, as I said, it addresses the needs of both internal and external stakeholders. And it focuses on processes that will create proactive, clear, aligned, and coordinated messages, and outlines expectations and outcomes to be used within a continuous feedback process improvement loop. So to help you with your communication efforts, we developed the BSCP Strategic Communication Toolbox. As I said, it's available at the BSCP Center website. And the toolbox provides a module-based stepwise process to help your SEA develop or enhance your strategic communication plan. And this webinar focuses on steps to support successful implementation of a strategic communication plan. So Module 6 covers a number of areas related to implementation of strategic communication plan. And as you know, gaining stakeholder clarity and support is a very critical part for achieving your SEA goals. So as you think about who your stakeholders are, and they're varied, you have policymakers, you have your internal staff that are going to be supporting the plan and its implementation, LEAs that implement the plan and are accountable for it, parents and stakeholders who are the LEA's customers, the general public. So how can you engage all those different stakeholders and their different roles and interests in a meaningful way to gain support for your SEA goals? So I invite you to either make your comment or type it in the box on the right side in the chat box, especially those of you SEAs that have been working on engaging stakeholders. How do you engage them to support your SEA goals? I think, Carrie, are you the only one online from Arkansas perspective?
That seems like it may be the case, yes.
So I know that Arkansas did a lot of stakeholder engagement when when Johnny Key came on, new to the system. Can you talk about what he did to kind of lead stakeholder engagement and what that meant for the SEA and their goals, supporting their goals?
Sure. So I think it took on a lot of different forms. In fact, he has this long Google sheet where he kept track of every time he engaged stakeholders in some way, or the senior leadership engaged stakeholders in some way, so that they could keep track of the various comments that they received, as well as just the number of touches that different groups had. So they used all kinds of forums for superintendents association, legislative outreach, regional events, as well as more one-way communication, email blasts and those kinds of things. But in doing that, they discovered that some of the goals that they had set out for themselves so closely aligned with where their stakeholders were wanting to go that their stakeholders then gave them almost the impetus to keep going, encourage them to continue moving down that path. And then one of the things that I found really interesting was how many of the stakeholders began to communicate back to the SEA, regardless of whether you do this or not, this is what we've already changed in our practice to move in that direction. And so it created that groundswell support for significant change long term.
Thank you for that. We've had a few comments typed in. One comment was, know what is important to the audience and connect to what they know and care about, to what you want to engage them in. And another comment was, ask them to be part of the goal-setting process, which I know is partly what you're going to hear about from Kansas today, because that was a critical part. Another thing I was going to mention real quickly, those of you that read the first strategic communication report that we did, we had an SCA that had a situation where they had a very well laid out education agenda of 10 items. A lot of folks said that it was going to be supported, and for some reason it had to go to referendum vote. And that SCA felt like they had thoroughly engaged policymakers but hadn't taken care of the general public and some folks that were opposed to just one or two of their items, but it ended up having they lost the vote, and the whole education agenda got struck down by not, there were also some big obstacles to overcome, but sometimes it's really critical to engage certain stakeholders to move forward your agenda. All right, well, thank you for those comments and for those examples. As you all know, writing a good plan sometimes is easier than getting it implemented. Today we'll be discussing plan implementation and refinement. So before we get into that, I'd like to ask one more discussion question. So what do you see as potential barriers when implementing and refining your strategic communication plan? Again, we'll take a few minutes for folks to either make a comment or type in a comment. And as you're thinking, I'm going to mention a few things that we've seen in SEAs. We'll see if some of you have experienced or seen the same thing. So regarding implementation and issues with stakeholders, we've seen not providing ample opportunity for stakeholders that, don't quite support the plan or they have misgivings about the plan, not giving them a voice or an opportunity to be heard. Sometimes a barrier could be not providing clarity to internal stakeholders on what their communication role is in supporting the plan. And then some implementation issues we've seen is just keeping the plan present, available, and on people's minds and accessible, finding a structured way to do that. Getting internal stakeholders to follow and apply processes within the plan. So maybe there are some good agreed upon processes, but they're just not being implemented or being followed. And then a big one we hear on evaluation is just finding the time and the tools to monitor and evaluate the plan. So curious if any of you have experienced those barriers or some other ones, and if so, did you find any ways to address or mitigate those barriers? We had one comment, strategic planning and process monitoring takes significant time, but it's worth it. But it can be challenging if not planned in advance. I totally agree with that. Any other thoughts on barriers for implementation? All right, well, thank you for your comments. We're going to go ahead and move on. So in this presentation, in the toolbox, we've divided tasks into 6 modules.
Module 1 covers the process of identifying resources, including management and other staff, to participate in development of a strategic communications plan. Module 2 will help you plan your team's and organization's messaging, including definition of goals and prioritization of those goals to develop your strategic plan. In Module 3, information and tools are provided to help craft the messages planned in Module 2. Message crafting at this stage involves identifying influencing factors that may impact your messages, defining target audiences, and developing draft messages. Modules 1 through 3 were covered in Webinar 1. Module 4 deals with internal communications, including fostering effective conditions for such communications and establishing processes to standardize and maximize efficiency in those communications. Module 5 covers external communications and provides information on how to identify communication channels and, similar to Module 4, establish standard, repeatable processes that may be used to help you communicate with external organizations and stakeholders. Modules 4 and 5 were covered in Webinar 2. Module 6, the last module of the BSCP Strategic Communications Toolbox, provides useful information on plan implementation and refinement, including how to engage others, recommendations for managing implementation, and how you can evaluate and adjust your plan moving forward.
And for each module, we have in other webinars discussed, and we will discuss the pertinent tasks by steps in detail. And then we provide insight on how the toolbox can help you complete the tasks. So in the first two webinars, if you look at the graphic there, it shows that we reviewed modules 1 through 5. Today we'll be covering the final module, which is implementation and refinement. And for more information on the other modules, you can refer to recorded webinar sessions. They are not quite available, but they will be soon on the BSCP website. So now let's get started on plan implementation. And I recommend if you have your toolbox in front of you that you turn to page 69. You can kind of follow along with the content. That way you can really pair the contents of the toolbox with what you're hearing. So Module 6 includes 4 critical steps for effective implementation of your strategic communication plan. So the first important piece is to address effective engagement of your different stakeholder groups. And that's because, as I sort of alluded to before, implementation effectiveness depends on the ability of your stakeholders to understand, contribute to the plan, and own the activities of your SCA agenda. And then step 2 addresses leveraging external partners to serve as advocates, experts, and points of connection between the SCA and other stakeholders. Step 3 is to create the clear plan, then, that can be used regularly as a driver of activities. In step 4, you would create a schedule of evaluation activities that use multiple ways of knowing what in your plan is working and identifying places where adjustments need to be made. So moving on to step 1 in Module 6, it addresses creating meaningful stakeholder engagement opportunities. The first thing to think about is the relevance of both internal and external stakeholders, and then consider the roles of all those different stakeholders and the best way to leverage their engagement. For each stakeholder, you should assess their information needs and how to best generate and leverage their engagement. And some things to think about would be which activity would most effectively carry your message and provide them with interactive opportunities. Some examples of those things would be town hall meetings or roundtable meetings, using social media, having press conferences, presentations in professional conferences, and one-on-one meetings. And to ensure that everyone's on the same page, you would also want to identify processes to ensure internal stakeholders are aware of messages and activities going out, and messages going out to external stakeholders. And I thought I'd throw out a reminder that in Module 3, we also introduced a few tools that you can use to identify your stakeholder needs. So since stakeholders are busy people, it's vital that any engagement activity be designed for maximum effectiveness. So to that end, we have here 8 criteria you should consider when you're designing an engagement activity. So let's say your goal is to gain community input on your state plan. And so you consider holding a town hall meeting for that purpose. So is that town hall meeting going to be appropriate for the audience and your goal of getting their input and whatever messages you want to convey about your process of creating the state plan? And will the town hall meeting provide, an opportunity for real, authentic engagement? Is it a venue where people can be heard? And then is that activity relevant to the desired outcomes again, of getting their input? And is it time to allow for maximum attendance for stakeholders? So, you know, the time of year matters, are they going to be available? But it's also really important that it's done in a way that is truly authentic in getting at ideas instead of just being a superficial act of just facilitating something after the fact. You'd want to consider what are the costs and resources you'll need to hold a town hall meeting. Is there any issues you need to think about community climate or cultural appropriateness when planning it? And then where should it be held? And, you know, you need a space that's big enough, that's accessible for enough people to engage in it. So those are 8 things to consider. Okay, so step 2 in Module 6 addresses engaging external partners. And finding the right external partners is a great way to augment resources to your SEA. And they're likely to be groups, organizations, or businesses that can help you achieve your goals and objectives. And their help could be financial. It could involve contributions of expertise, use of communication channels, or other resources. One caution we want to offer in engaging partners is that having a process to do it in a strategic manner is really important. We found in our work in some SEAs that partners were being engaged without a process. So sometimes separate divisions were engaging partners to help with different things, but they weren't aware of each other. So in some cases, the end result is that you had too many partners doing similar work. So taking some steps to consider partner engagement holistically could go a long way in making those partnerships more efficient and effective. And so to engage partners and work through a centralized process, some things to consider would be determine what your SAA needs the most, and that'll help you set the priorities and guide who you want to contact. Then you identify potential partners based on those needs. You want to be sure to use a process to leverage the staff that are familiar with those potential partners, and then decide on criteria that will result in selecting the most efficient, effective, and reputable partners. So, for example, if you want to use regional service centers to help get messages out to LEAs, you know, have people done that in the past? What are your staff members' familiarity with the regional centers? Are they on the same page as the SEA? Those are the types of things you would want to think through. And then once you've decided on who you want to approach, you want to strategize that approach by making your needs and expectations of that partner very clear. And ideally, your ask would be mutual beneficial. So at minimum, your partner should be rewarded with positive community exposure and recognition for their efforts, both of which could be valuable to businesses and other organizations. So step 3 of Module 6 would be addressing actual plan implementation. So to this point, you've developed your strategic communication plan, you've developed the key messages, you've identified communication channels for those messages, and you've engaged relevant stakeholders and partners. So it's time to implement the plan. To manage implementation, there are 7 items you should consider and include in the plan. So one is to designate a staff member to serve as a point of contact for all implementation activities. This individual would manage the overall implementation and give regular progress reports as needed. Someone on your oversight or implementation team might be ideal for that. And then you want to list all the anticipated implementation activities. For each activity, you'll outline all the steps under the activity in order that led to completion. You'll assign a budget estimate and a staffing estimate on each step. And then you'd want to work backwards from completion and assign a completion date for each step. And set regular times to revisit the plan and address issues as needed. You want to be sure to select an approach that ensures implementation is managed and monitored for consistency, and that there are regular opportunities to proactively identify issues and resolve problems. Your approach should also be efficient and effective for time and budget and be well-paced. And I'm going to press pause there, and I'm sorry I'm picking on you again, Carrie, but I just wanted to have you maybe speak just for a minute about how the strategic performance management has helped Arkansas in managing plan implementation.
Well, the benefit of strategic performance management is there's that constant process of checking up on implementation steps. So the process is in place, that continuous review cycle is in place for all of the work of the agency that's moving toward the strategic direction, which includes the communications component. So I think that real benefit comes from, it's not something that just the communication team is trying to do to manage their plan implementation, but everyone in the agency is managing plan implementation and reporting in regular cycles.
That's helpful. It also makes me think about another tool we used that was an online environment that was used in Virginia, where they were able to visit their plan regularly and see the status of each step and have a team discussion, okay, if that step is behind, what resources are needed, and it was just a regular process that kept things moving. I don't think Kimberly, the communication director from Arkansas, is online, but I wanted to point out that on the last webinar, she showed some actual implementation tools that they use in Arkansas. So aside from what we're going to show you in the toolbox, if you're interested in seeing something from another SCA, if you get on the contact list, you could reach out to Kimberly. So let's move on to step 4 of Module 6, which is to evaluate and adjust. And in some ways, from what we've seen, this is the most challenging part of plan implementation, because we found that SCAs often lack the resources, so time, skills, and tools to evaluate activities in their plans. So, you know, it's one thing to really spend time monitoring your plan and another to invest the time to evaluate it. But it's vital that all your work that you did for plan development isn't lost due to poor ongoing maintenance of the plan and its activities. So to evaluate and adjust, you should have a well-defined protocol to measure your process. And one way to look at measurement would be in 2 primary areas. So one is, are your actual processes working? This evaluation can involve quantifying engagement. So you could look at tracking requests for information, looking at SCA website visits, doing event surveys, analyzing media mentions, or looking at social media likes, shares, or retweets, or internal surveys. And another way to look at evaluation is to ask, is the communication process improving clarity, alignment, and increased support for the agency's agenda? And so some techniques you could use there would include doing surveys, focus groups, interviews, and analysis of media coverage, and feedback from employees. As part of the evaluation protocol, the communications oversight team should design a reporting schedule which periodically reviews the plan and all the relevant metrics to make updates and continuously improve communication efforts. And one thing that I haven't seen a lot but I think would be really helpful would be maybe if the SCA could engage their research and evaluation team, because they could be a great resource for helping create a plan for the evaluation, suggest some tools. Maybe there's some data and metrics they already collect that would be informative for evaluating your strategic communication plan. Now let's look at the toolbox to see what resources are available to help you implement and evaluate your plan. So looking at the toolbox, Module 6 covers the tasks we discussed for implementing and evaluating the plan. It has narrative tests around the text around those tasks. And it also includes, so for step 1 that we reviewed on creating meaningful stakeholder engagement activities, if you turn to page 70, there it is. James, do you want to explain the 2 different views they have on the screen?
I would love to. So here, what you'll see within the WebEx window is we're actually showing an electronic version of the tool within WebEx. So you will be able to adjust the zoom using the drop-down at the bottom left corner of your screen, or the little magnifying glass with a plus or a minus. You'll also be able to scroll as you'd like through a particular page once it's up. Now, note, if you do look at the toolbox from within WebEx, we will be changing the page to follow along with the presentation flow. but you will be able to navigate wherever you'd like within that page. Now, as I mentioned before, we did include a link in chat, so if you'd like to go to that outside of WebEx, you can do that. Just leave this presentation window open and then minimize that supplemental toolbox window when we get back to the presentation.
Great, thank you. So for me, I don't like to mess with full screen. I like to, because I worry I'm going to lose what I have on the right side. So I have scrolled down to the bottom, and so what James is showing is page 70. And this is a set of questions that would be useful to use in a group and a team to consider in creating stakeholder engagement activities. And then if you move to page 71, still addressing step 1, stakeholder engagement. There's an example from Arkansas. It just explains how they engage stakeholders around their state vision. And then moving on to page 78, still step 1, stakeholder engagement. That's Appendix M, and as you'll see at the top, it's a sample stakeholder mapping template. So that can help you identify relevant stakeholders for each activity. So you scroll down and you see on there that there's some questions that you can engage in your team with that. And then you would fill out the other portion of the template. Yep, there it is right there. So after you ask those questions, then here is how the mapping tool works. And things are divided into high interest, neutral interest, low interest, and that helps you identify stakeholder needs. Okay, so for step 3, which if you recall was manage plan implementation, on page 80, Appendix N, is a sample implementation tracking tool, and that can be used to monitor overall implementation process. When you scroll through, there's a tactic, target audience, timing, cost, responsibility, and then a place to log results. And then for step 4, evaluate and adjust, we have a few things. Page 82, Appendix O, it's a sample evaluation tool, and it can be used as a basis to develop evaluation resources related to your plan. And so if you scroll down, at least that's the approach that I use. There's a component, and then there's an indicator or evaluation question, and then a place to identify data methods. Okay, and then page 84, and I had a couple of people called this out before and thought this was useful. This is taken from the Colorado Department of Education. I don't know if they still use it. It was collected in 2014, but I thought it was a really neat tool. It's a functional example of how they assess their communication efforts. So if you look at the first page there, they're looking at strategy, tactic, metrics, and trends. And then if you flip to the next page, one up before, James, I think that would be page 85. I don't know if it's going to let you do that. But if you flip, if those of you that are following along, if you flip to page 85, it has a neat little chart then that their system comes up with that shows a nice visual with data points on each of the metrics. And then if you want to check if you've addressed all the steps in Module 6, you would go back to page 77. There's a quality check. In the toolbox, there's actually one of these at the end of each module so that you could go through as kind of as a checklist to see that you addressed all the steps in any given module. And then also, just wanted to call your attention that we do have a resource page at the end of the toolbox. And the resources are divided by content area, and we've got some really, really good ones on stakeholder engagement in particular, and some on evaluation. So this is also a good place to find some additional resources, is that back page. So that's an overview of Module 6. And now our guest speakers, Dr. Watson and the Commissioner, and Denise Kaelier, the Director of Communications and Recognition Programs, will share their experiences in creating a coherent SEA agenda through a comprehensive community engagement process. So I will turn it over to my Kansas friends.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for allowing us the opportunity to talk a little bit about our process here in Kansas and what we've tried to do. We had an opportunity a couple of years ago in 2015 to really change the conversation in Kansas away from a No Child Left Behind era. And at this time, we didn't know what the new era was going to be. The SSA was not reauthorized at this point, but we knew it was going to be different. And so we just simply started to ask ourselves internally, are we prepared to enter this new phase, and are we preparing students to be successful in today's global economy and for the world in which they're going to join? And we knew this could be huge and meaningful change for Kansas education, but we had to start to think about, well, where do we begin in this process? So all of us start with, basic questions, and we weren't any different. What do we need to know? Who will we need to involve? How will we accomplish this task? What will we do once we get all this information? And then how will we build support were some of the key questions. And of course, the overriding, the really big theme that we were trying to ascertain from Kansans is, what do they want from the K-12 education system? And I think if you're an SEA or an LEA or you're a legislator, the challenge that every state and every local municipality has in education is that we come to the table all with differing ideas of what education should provide and should do. And so this was really, I think, critical as to what do we want for our education system. So we formulated 3 simple questions about what we wanted to know. And the first was, when we went out, we asked participants, what are the characteristics, qualities, abilities, and skills of a successful 24-year-old Kansan? There's nothing magical about picking 24-year-old. It could have been 30, it could have been 25. We were just really trying to think of an age of which most people have completed their formal education and are embarking on a career. So that's why 24. Once we had that question, which was really the bulk of the work that we did, the second and the third questions were simply to support that. So if this is what we want, or then we say these are the characteristics, qualities of what someone who's successful looks like, then what is the role of K-12, if any, in achieving the future for that child? And then what's the role of higher ed, again, if any, in achieving that outcome? And so then we had to decide, well, who to involve. And obviously, in your internal, we had the Kansas State Board of Ed, who really kind of issued the general challenge for the agency and myself to go out and kind of glean this information, and of course KSD staff. I made the decision right off the bat that we would engage the external community first, while keeping the internal community up to date what we were doing, but that we would engage them after we had done what we called the tour of Kansas to get that information. So we knew we had to build support all across these external. It was an interesting time in Kansas, and we had to make sure we had higher ed support, legislative support, and then broad support from all the stakeholders that would be involved in K-12 education.
A map of Kansas showing the 20 community locations included in the tour, along with 7 locations related to business and industry feedback.
So we went out. We went out to 20 different locations represented here in the blue dots. Simply in these communities, we just advertised open forums. Anyone could come. We had a lot of educators, a lot of parents, quite a few higher education members on these 20 original community tours. And we asked those 3 questions in free-form response and engaged in discussion over those 3 questions. We noticed when we got back from those original 20 in blue that our business participation, as noted by the participants, was somewhat small. So we engaged our state chamber of commerce and asked them if we could engage local chambers of commerce and just simply get a business perspective on those 3 questions. And they were very helpful in doing that. So in the brighter colored, we went back out to 7 different locations in Kansas, sponsored by local chambers through our state chamber of commerce, asked the same 3 questions to business leaders throughout our state. And these were some of our major businesses in Kansas, and also mom and pop shops as we did this. Also, KSD staff, we kept them involved. We had a way in which we held session 1 just for them to give feedback too. So we got their feedback as we were also collecting this across the state. The next critical step for us is, well, then what do we all agree we want for our children? And I think it's important to know the political climate that we were dealing in Kansas. It was a very contentious environment related to the State Board of Ed, the legislature, the executive branch, and what I call the field. And mainly over money, perception from the field of a lack of financial support for K-12 education. It was being litigated at the time. And so there were a lot of questions, even as we went out in the 27 different locations, was, well, what about money? What about money? And we knew that was the most polarizing question you could ask. What we were trying to get agreement on is where should we move the system? And then we knew we would circle back on the money side of it. I would just let you know, this frustrated lots of educators because they wanted to jump to the money, and we wanted to make sure we had a very clear picture of where we wanted to go. And it allowed us to get our constituents really emotionally tied to this work that we were going to do on their behalf. So we had all this information. We collected over 2,000 responses from Kansans. It's the largest qualitative study of this type ever done in our state. We gave the free form information to our researchers here at KSDE and also at Kansas State University. They worked in tandem with each other to analyze it. And just interesting side note, the data was so large that the software that Kansas State had to run qualitative software could not handle the volume and the number of responses and to categorize it. So we finally got all that categorized and we had it organized. And then before we did anything with it, we said, you know, since we're synthesizing this data that came from really free response form information on focus groups, we ought to go ask people, is this what you meant? When you synthesize anything, you worry that maybe you've inserted some bias in that. So we went back out to 10 locations across the state and just simply said, did we get this right? Did we hear you correctly, and is this what you think you meant? There was a little bit of tweaking from that, but by and large, Kansas said, yes, that's spot on. That's what we wanted in our system. At the same time, our researchers were taking all of this data and comparing it and contrasting it with national and international research on effective school, efficient schools, redesigned schools, schools that were high performing. And so once we had all this done, we were coupling the research and the qualitative research that we had accomplished together. Ultimately, we gave that to the State Board of Education, and they conducted a series of retreats where they came up with a new vision for education in Kansas. That vision was to lead the world in the success of each student. I like to say, obviously, 2 important parts to that vision. Lead the world, it's very ambitious. So, yes, we talk about beating Finland and Singapore, and we do it in what we think is the most intriguing part of this vision, which is the success of each student. 2 key parts to that. Success, and that word was chosen deliberately to not mean achievement, but success, which encompasses, we think, much more than just student achievement. and then each student, not just looking at aggregate totals or even disaggregated totals, but achievement, success for each student. Now, we knew when we put this forward 2 years ago that this was very much our metaphor and very much like Kennedy issuing a challenge to land a man on the moon at a time when we were not very good at sending rockets into space. And so our board used that metaphor and said, yes, we're going to have this as a decade-long journey. We're now getting ready to start year 3 into that journey, and we're creating some redesigned schools and some other things related to it. Our communication plan then, of course, had to be, after we developed this, had to be really tremendous and great. And I want to turn it over to Denise, that she'll talk about how they work to brand this new vision and then move it forward and really create a momentum in Kansas that I don't know that we've seen. It really has moved our state board into a prominence of truly leading education. It's not so much a legislative function. It really, the state board's looked upon as leading this because of the way this came about.
Thanks, Randy. So as we talked about, in order to really promote this vision, we built an entire brand around it. And so we chose the motto, Kansans Can. And how this came about is we really felt like this was really the essence of who Kansas is, that we are a community of people who believe in working hard, persevering when things get tough, and essentially that we can pretty much accomplish anything. So we used this phrase and invited people to actually finish the phrase. And 9 times out of 10, when people said, you know, we said, finish the phrase, Kansans can, 9 times out of 10, people said, can do anything they set their minds to. So that's really what we wanted people to, their reaction to it, because we needed them to understand that this vision is huge, and we're going to accomplish it because we are Kansans, and we do have that ability to accomplish anything we set our minds to. So the coolest thing about this, I think, from a communication standpoint, is this really revitalized our field. Our educators who had, over a few years, as Randy had mentioned, kind of a polarized legislative system, had kind of felt a little bit maybe underappreciated, maybe weren't as excited about the profession. They are very excited about the profession now, and Randy has done an amazing job bringing community into our legislative process as well and building support there. So we took this Kansans Can motto and we actually created an entire set of tools and marketing tools that we've developed for our schools, for our businesses, for our chambers of commerce, et cetera, and just built an entire vision. So if our community couldn't remember Kansas leads the world and the success of each student, they get the Kansans Can. And when they saw Kansans Can, they go, yeah, that's that new vision for education. So it was short and it was easy to grasp onto. So what we did with these materials then, of course, like I said, on here we've got a website. We developed videos of the commissioner delivering about a 1-minute presentation about each of the pieces of the vision. We push those out through to our field and to our public through social media. But probably the most visible piece, and probably the one that has become kind of the trademark of this entire brand, has been our lapel pin, which you'll see on the upper right quadrant of this slide right here. People are excited about this pin. It's a visible way for them to show their support. And you will see state workers, Kansas State Department of Education workers. We are always wearing our pins. We're always out and about with them, as well as our board. We've even been known to get the governor to wear them. So the way that we use these tools, though, is that we sent them out in various ways to the field, to our chambers of commerce, and through our associations, our education associations, with some very specific asks. We asked them to post the posters in their businesses. We asked them to post the logo to their website. So we're asking them to engage in a very active way and in a very specific way with these materials. So as I mentioned earlier, we developed the Vision Toolkit, which included a lot of those materials, and sent them out to our different stakeholder groups. We also conducted a very extensive media tour, and every time, so this is, again, as Randy mentioned, this is the year 3 of our vision. So we have tiered this vision year after year with different initiatives being presented. Every time we have a major initiative presented, we send Commissioner Watson out to editorial boards across the state to get that out there to them first. And I think that's really been helpful in getting us some positive traction with the media. Other ways that we have engaged our constituents, we held a business summit because it's very important that we get our business community involved in this, because this does talk about how do we get our students ready for, today's and tomorrow's workforces. We do several presentations to the legislature. Again, Dr. Watson's done an amazing job with those presentations because they are excited. And that, honestly, in the last few years has been the first time that I've witnessed where our legislators are really talking about the vision and are excited about it. We've also partnered with other state agencies. We needed to partner with Department of Commerce and Labor and our Secretary of Insurance because those were all going to be critical pieces as part of our plan has to do with internships, job shadowing. We had to get those pieces into place before we could move forward. Another program that Dr. Watson developed was our Kansas Education Fellows. We took some of our previous Kansas Teacher of the Year winners, some of our top educators, and we knew that in order for other educators to hear this message, it should come peer-to-peer. So we trained them on how to talk about the vision, how to deliver it, and they went out to various districts throughout the state and presented it. And our next tier then is we're actually taking more of our, what we call our Kansas Exemplary Educators Network, and we are training them to be leaders of this vision. So we're really expanding our capacity to share the vision on that.
The timeline of the Kansas School District's redesign development plan.
So this just gives you a quick overview of kind of where we're at in our process. We update this as we go along. Just some key milestones. We try to keep this information out front of the public so that we're being very transparent in our work, and we just want to make sure that we're continuing to bring all of our constituents along with us. So the next piece of our work, and I want to pull your attention, in 2017 you'll see Kansas Can School redesign. This is our next piece of our initiative and of the vision work, and this is one of our major initiatives. We've been planning all this work for the last couple of years, and now it's time to really get this work into schools. So as Dr. Watson had mentioned earlier, we did start a school redesign initiative where we had selected 7 districts that are actually going to be completely giving up 1 elementary and 1 secondary school to be redesigned around the components of the vision of what Kansans told us they wanted their schools to be. So what's going to be key about this step in our vision work is that we have to maintain transparency throughout this. So we have to make sure that we are communicating across all of our constituent bases, legislators, parents, with our other districts that aren't part of this 7-district process, and with our education partners, and specifically with our businesses as well. What's working, what's not, so that we can go back and adjust and make sure that we're giving the good, bad, and the ugly on this. We can't just give the good. We have to gain support and trust for what we're doing by being fully transparent. So in doing all that, then, like Arkansas, we started the SPM, the Strategic Performance Management or Plan Management process, and that's where we're at right now. Is we've been working our plan. We're now at the point where we are planning the actual work. We have done some realignment within our agency around the different parts of the vision so that we're better we're better aligned to that work than what we were. But so really, our work, if you can believe it, is really just beginning. So where does this leave us, and kind of what are our lessons learned on to date, what we've done? And my first thought when Heather asked us to do this and looking through the toolbox is, gosh, where was this 2 years ago when we kind of started all of this work? And it gets you to really kind of reflect on where you've been and the work that you've done. And while I believe that we have done some amazing work in the few short years that we've started this, because this is a major initiative for our state. And it has revitalized really the whole education industry in our state, I would say. We have people excited, but I'm going to be the first person to say, you know, we all have these great plans that we're going to put together, and we're going to have this really comprehensive plan, and then life happens. And sometimes you don't have the comprehensive plan that you want. So that's why this toolbox to me is so critical, because it forces you to step back and look at all the different pieces and say, did I do this, did I not do that? So I would say if I had to really critique myself, the two areas where I am going to be focusing my improvement are going to be on follow-up and evaluation. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Follow-up meaning once we've engaged our constituents and we've given our ask, is actually going back and following through with them and saying, how did that go? How's it coming for you? Should we be doing something different? Are there different tools? Did the toolbox work for you? Can we be amending those tools at all? And to some degree we do that, but probably not in a big enough formal plan. In fact, we have a group called the Kansas Professional Learning Team, and they're made up of our service centers and a lot of our leadership from the field, and they'll actually look at our materials and they'll let us know, that doesn't really, I don't think that's going to fly with the field, or we may need to tweak that a little bit. So we do have that, but that's something that I would like to see myself build more of that into it. And of course, there's always that piece about evaluation. And I think that's the piece that most of us, if we're being honest, will admit that we omit. And that's going back and really measuring how did our efforts help. And we look at our media, we look at our media hits, we look at our social media accounts. But I was really blown away in the toolkit by Colorado's communication scorecard. And that's something that I'm going to be looking at doing and really taking more time to really evaluate our processes. So especially when you're engaging so many different stakeholder groups in so many different ways, I think that's a really critical step that a lot of us miss. So that's us in a nutshell right there, but of course we probably left out about 2 hours worth of information on that.
Well, thank you so much, Randy and Denise. As you all can tell, they've done some incredible work there in Kansas. We did 2 different communication studies in Kansas, and you can find examples of things from Kansas in our first and second reports that you'll find in the BSCP website. Even some national organizations like CCSSO have said to me, wow, you know, Kansas is doing some really incredible things. So Randy and Denise, I thank you so much for sharing the work that you've done. I know it's hard to get it all in a short amount of time, but I know from going there and hearing from different people that it's really been a game changer in your state. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to open this up for so many neat things that you guys are doing. I wanted to open up for those of you online that want to ask questions, either type them in or ask them to Randy and Denise about what they've gone over, about their Cans and Can campaign and how they put it together.
And also just a quick note, if you wanted to type in your questions using the chat area, to do that, you will want to just type your question in the available box in the chat area, and then make sure that the Send To drop-down above that says All Participants. And once you have that and your question in the box, then you can go ahead and click Send, and that way everybody will be able to see it.
I'm going to go ahead and start with one. Denise, I saw you listed as partners that helped, that you engaged some other state education agencies. Can you talk a little bit about how you engaged them and what they did?
Sure. For instance, we engaged with the Kansas Association of School Boards because obviously school boards are a very important voice when it comes to adopting anything new. And so we actually got them, and we talked with them about the vision. We got them to let us know whether they would support that. They went back to their membership. They talked about it with them. And they came out with and actually publicly presented a letter and a statement saying that they're fully supportive of this vision, which was huge for us. And then that gave us more leverage as we went back out. And so we got various groups that to come out and actually say, we're with them. We engage, we support this. So that was very important and gave us some more leverage that we could use going out.
Interesting. Cheryl, are you still on the line?
Yes, I am.
I'm really struck, I don't know about you, but when I hear them talk about their Cans and Scan campaign and how it's kind of a tagline that sticks and travels, and it's really kind of redefined and opened up a real true understanding of where the state's trying to go. I'm struck by some similarities with Michigan, and I'm wondering your thoughts on that. Did some of the things that they discussed spark any ideas or similarities to you for Michigan?
Yes, it was very exciting to hear about their campaign, and they're in year 3. In Michigan, we're just in year 2 of a strategic plan to become a top 10 education state in 10 years. And so we are still working on improving the communication system in the state. There are campaigns that have been going on similar to what Kansas has talked about in terms of getting the message out that this is the strategic plan and so forth, but we are still in the process of developing an internal and external communication plan for the state. So this is really helpful to hear about what others are doing.
That's great.
And Heather, I did want to call out, there was a question also delivered via chat from Dean asking, how have local superintendents reacted to the process?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, so our superintendents have been very supportive about all of this. Obviously, their first concern is, oh my gosh, how do we accomplish this? What do we need to do? So we've really done a lot by way of presentations and training with them, a lot of one-on-one. But I will tell you, one of our biggest challenges, if you will, and this is something that I guess we always have to build into our communications plan, is we work in such a system that we send the information to superintendents for them to then disseminate to their principals and their educators. And what we're finding is that information gets stuck at that superintendent level. So that's something that we have really been working to work through to try to break that. And so you'll see us out in the field with a lot more presentations, and we're specifically working to get to our educators. The one thing that we have built into our plan, though, is to remember that you know, we're in year 4, and so you assume that everyone's heard your vision or your message, and they haven't. And that's something that you need to continuously put in your plan, is a piece for those people who, even in year 3, right, in your field, have not heard your vision. And to continuously go back to the ground floor and re-emphasize that message. So that's something that we have made sure to keep in our plan.
It's helpful. I had another question about stakeholder engagement, and we've heard this from other states. So you've had all these people engage on the process, contribute to what they want students to know and do when they leave your system. And I really love the step where you all go back and make sure that you interpreted correctly what their input is. what are your plans to keep stakeholders engaged throughout the process?
Well, that's a great question, and obviously all of our stakeholders are going to have to be continuously engaged because they're all going to be coming in at different parts of the plan. Right now, we, again, with our school redesign, I mean, that can be a little bit controversial. When you're talking about redesigning a system, there are some that may not, you know, there's a lot of people that believe in a very traditional school system because that's all they know. So to shift that conversation, it will be very critical that we bring our parents and the public along, and that's what I was saying about being very transparent in all of that work and having to say, look, you know, much like, and the moonshot is so important here, and kind of much like that, sometimes you don't have all of the answers. You know, you're building it as, they were building the rocket as they were going. They were building their return pattern as they were up. So we have to be very transparent about that, but our ultimate message is, you know, to do nothing isn't an option. So for us, it's really maintaining that transparency. We have a very big business component, and that is starting to ramp up a little bit because our businesses are saying, you know, we're not getting people that are employable. They don't have the skills we need. Okay, so you know, the next part of this will be engaging our businesses in the classroom and getting our classrooms into businesses so that they can, in essence, kind of help grow their own, if you will. We've really been pointing a lot to the Georgetown Center on Education and Workforce Policy, and it's talking about by the year 2020 in Kansas, 71% of our jobs will require some form of post-secondary education. That could be a certification, 2-year, 4-year, going into the military. So, I mean, that tells us that we've got to do something different. But it's not just about, you know, getting kids academically prepared, because what our businesses are saying is, I get kids that can't come to work on time, and then, you know, they're on their cell phone within 30 minutes, and then by the end of the day they go, well, I want a raise. So, you know, it's that type of thing. So we're very engaged every step of the way. But like I said, that engagement will come at different phases of the plan.
We've had a comment and a question. Ellen Balkenbush mentioned the parallels in the communication of Kansas CAN and Missouri's top 10 and 20 strategic plans are amazingly similar. So I think we're seeing a little bit of an ongoing trend with packaging a whole approach into something that, you know, people can hang on to and be a part of and get excited about is growing.
Yeah.
And then we have a question from Jennifer Watson. What are some specific ways you're communicating KSDE's strategic plan to your internal stakeholders and making them feel a part of the vision?
Sure. Well, some things that we have done is, well, obviously we have a weekly internal newsletter, and we always have a section in there that talks about the vision or about current work of the vision. We try to get through, we did a little, tried to start a little campaign with our folks to say, okay, how do I impact the vision, getting them to do some videos about how they themselves impact the vision, because everybody has to understand how their work is contributing to it. But during our SPM process, that's really where we've engaged stakeholders. Right now we've got opportunities, so we've assigned people into specific work groups, but then we also have given staff members the opportunity to volunteer in areas where they feel like they've got some expertise that they can bring, that they're interested in bringing to it. So all of that is transpiring right now. They're at the point where they're developing the actual work that will support the goals and initiatives that have been set through the plan. So we do keep this front and center. Again, the lapel pin is as minute as that sounds. We make sure that our employees always have that as a reminder of our vision, and that's included in their signature line of their email. So we do engage them at every step that we can. Sometimes you can't engage everybody at the same level that they would love, but everyone is being communicated with on the vision. They're having input into the work of the agency. So that's kind of where we're at this point.
That's helpful. Thank you. I'm also glad that you mentioned your engagement with SPM. Arkansas has been engaged with BSCP and SPM Strategic Performance Management, and so is Kansas. And one of the things we were thinking about when we developed this toolbox was SEA goals are the driver, or should be the driver, of the SEA strategic plan, and should be the driver of what the SEA communicates about. So what we would eventually hope is that the overall approach to communication and the communication plan gets embedded not only in the strategic plan, but in the big process that we call strategic performance management, of thinking about how your SEA is organized and how do all the different divisions function and how are they structured around the SEA vision, mission, and goals. So we're excited to have another state that's doing great communication work that's also engaged in strategic performance management. Those were great questions. Let me see if I have, okay, here's another comment from Bershero. Please share ideas of getting information from the SEA to the classroom level. Dissemination of information to district superintendents doesn't work in all cases for our state either. Yeah, we actually, go ahead, Denise.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to say, yeah, that was one of the reasons why when I was talking about how we conducted kind of a leadership special section with some of our Kansas exemplary educators. We actually brought in Commissioner Watson, and we made it a real special deal that we brought them in, and we talked to them on how they can be leaders of this vision, leaders of this change, and armed them with materials and whatnot, with kind of a go forth and communicate with your peers. And that's part of what we need to follow up on and say, did you gain any traction that way? That, you know, we're like everybody else, and we're just looking for any way we can to get into that classroom.
Yeah, I was going to say tends to be a tough nut to crack. We have heard the concern about getting information down to the teacher and classroom level over multiple years. In our second benchmarking report, and we talked about a little bit in webinar 2, at that time, Indiana, they had the same concern, and so what they did is their letter that they had I can't believe it was weekly, I'm not sure. There was a weekly communication from the commissioner that went to superintendents, and so they created a teacher-level letter so that teachers also receive a letter and the same information, because it wasn't going, past the superintendents. And the other technique that we've seen other SEAs do in keeping teachers engaged with each other, and also just using them as advocates, is using teacher voices to talk about activities toward SEA goals and messages, and to gain support for different things. So there are a few examples in our second benchmarking report. Let me scroll down. Final call for any questions that you all might have for Randy or Denise. All right, well, as we mentioned earlier, this toolbox is a work in progress, so we plan to update it based on needs from the field. So, for example, we will probably be looking for more examples of, successful examples of SEAs on how they're getting past the superintendent level down into the classroom. So that may be one area. We may try to collect some examples and tools to add to the toolbox. Right now, if you take time to list anything that we did not cover or that you'd like to learn more about in depth about implementing a strategic communication plan, James will probably explain it better, but if you type under the polling box, you'll see gray under the poll question. There's a box that says type your answer there, and you just put your cursor in and type what your response is. Did I capture that correctly, James?
Yeah, it was pretty good. If you just use the polling feature on the right, you can enter your response, again, by clicking in the box that says type your answer here. Then once that answer's in, you go ahead and click Submit button, and we'll take it.
And just like we mentioned that evaluation is important for these plans, we really do pay attention to any responses we have on polls, to survey input that we have. This will really help us not only add to the toolbox and make it more useful for the field, but also deciding on next steps for how we want to engage folks with the toolbox and help people use it as a way to help them move their communication agenda forward. As I hope you all can tell, other than getting information about strategic communication and the contents of the toolbox, one of what I feel like is the greatest value adds from a webinar like this is to get ideas from each other, especially those of you in the field doing the work. And so we encourage you to collaborate with each other on your strategic communication plans. And so we want to provide you with an opportunity to be included on a contact sheet distributed to attendees of this webinar. This sheet will be a way to use to establish and foster collaboration between you as you move forward.